Imagine an empire, not one of stone and steel, but of cocaine and cash. An empire so vast it stretched from the streets of Detroit to the suburbs of Atlanta, from LA to St. Louis. An organisation with over 500 employees, moving hundreds of kilos of cocaine every single month and generating millions upon millions of dollars. This wasn't some shadowy, hidden cartel. This was the Black Mafia Family, or BMF. And they were so bold, so audacious, they bought freeway billboards to announce to the world that it was theirs. For a few years in the early 2000s, the BMF, led by two brothers, Demetrius and Terry Flannery, seemed untouchable. They weren't just drug kingpins, they were celebrities in their own right, mingling with the rich and famous, throwing lavish parties, and using a hip-hop record label, BMF Entertainment, as the perfect front for their real business. Their method was sophisticated. They used a fleet of vehicles, often luxury limousines, fitted with secret hydraulic compartments called traps. Kilos of cocaine would travel one way, and stacks of cash, millions of dollars, would travel back the other, heading straight to their Mexican sources of supply. It was a well-oiled, nationwide machine. But like all empires built on such a volatile foundation, it was destined to crumble. And the story of its fall is a masterclass in modern law enforcement, a saga of violence, surveillance, and the slow, methodical untangling of a criminal web that took years, and the cooperation of nearly a dozen federal and local agencies. The beginning of the end really kicked into high gear around 2003 and 2004. The DEA had BMF on their radar, but the sheer scale of the operation made it a daunting target. The Flannery brothers operated with a level of confidence that bordered on arrogance. But that high profile came with a price. Their presence, especially in their Atlanta hub, brought a wave of violence. On July 25th, 2004, that violence spilled out into a Midtown club parking lot. A 23-year-old man named Rashanable Drummond was shot and killed. The man allegedly responsible, a BMF associate named Fleming Daniels. It was a stark reminder that behind the flashy parties and hip-hop facade was a brutal, dangerous enterprise. Law enforcement was closing in. Later that year, in November 2004, the Atlanta police and DEA agents raided an expensive BMF stash house in northwest Atlanta. Demetrius Flannery, the charismatic co-leader known as Big Meech, managed to flee just in time. The house was empty of people but full of evidence. Officers found guns, fake IDs, a little marijuana, and a ton of BMF paraphernalia. They also confiscated two vehicles. One of them was a 2003 Hummer H2 stretch limousine, a classic BMF trap vehicle. Now this is where the story takes a fascinating turn. The feds searched that limo, but they didn't find the traps. The compartments were that well hidden. So the government did what it does. It forfeited the vehicle and sold it at a public auction. Life went on. The limo passed from one innocent owner to the next. The BMF investigation continued, culminating in a massive, multi-city takedown in October 2005. Indictments dropped in Detroit, Louisville, and Orlando. Dozens of BMF members were arrested in LA, St. Louis, and Greenville, South Carolina. The empire was officially falling apart. The Flannery brothers themselves were eventually indicted in Detroit, convicted, and each handed a 30-year prison sentence. 10 other key players in the Atlanta case also received hefty federal prison terms, ranging from 5 to over 16 years. But let's go back to that Hummer limo. It's now August 2008, almost 4 years after the raid. The limo is with its fourth owner, a person who has no idea about its history. DEA agents get a tip. A source tells them they missed something back in 2004. There are still traps in that Hummer, and they are not empty. So, agents track down the vehicle. Can you imagine getting that knock on your door? Federal agents with a search warrant for the stretch limo you bought, telling you it used to belong to one of the biggest drug lords in the country. They get inside, and this time they find them. The hidden compartments pop open, and inside, 7 semi-automatic firearms and nearly $900,000 in cash. It was believed to be the proceeds from one of the BMF's very last major cocaine deals before the whole thing came crashing down. The ghost of the empire, literally hidden in plain sight. So how did they do it? How did the DEA and the FBI and all these other agencies manage to dismantle an organization that was so widespread and so insulated? The answer, in large part, comes down to one thing: wiretaps. And the key to understanding their power is the case of a man named Tory Sims. The Detroit DEA had been investigating BMF since late 2003. By May of 2004, they had enough evidence to get a judge to authorize a wiretap on Terry Flenory's phone, the more business-minded, behind-the-scenes brother. Listening in, agents started hearing multiple calls about cocaine distribution between Terry and another man, someone they suspected was Tory Sims. But they needed to prove it. The break came on June 17, 2004. A BMF driver was on his way to Louisville when he got pulled over. Inside his car, police found 10 kilograms of cocaine, but just as valuable was the cell phone they recovered. They checked the call log, and one of the recent calls was to a contact named Kiana Tory. The phone number matched the one used by the man on the wiretap who was talking to Terry Flenory. That was the link. The Detroit DEA immediately looped in their counterparts in Louisville, who used that information to apply for their own wiretap, this time on the phone Tory Sims was using. The affidavit they submitted to the judge was incredibly detailed. It laid out the entire Detroit investigation, the intercepted calls with Terry Flenory, and the evidence from the traffic stop. It also included information from a confidential source who told agents he'd bought cocaine directly from Sims before. A judge in Kentucky signed off on it. The tap went live, and the evidence just poured in. They intercepted call after call about selling and distributing cocaine. That wiretap led them straight to the home of Sims's girlfriend, Karen Johnson. When they searched it, they found scales, drug ledgers, and Black Mafia insignia. The wiretap was the foundation upon which the government built its case, not just against Sims, but against the entire network he was connected to. Sims was eventually indicted, convicted by a jury, and he appealed, arguing that the wiretap that brought him down was illegal from the start. This is where we get into the legal weeds, but it's crucial because it shows just how difficult it is to get this kind of evidence, and how carefully the government has to follow the rules. Sims claimed the court made 4 huge errors. His main arguments were that the government didn't prove the wiretap was truly necessary, and that they didn't have enough probable cause to get it in the first place. Let's tackle necessity first. Federal law is very clear about this. A wiretap is supposed to be a tool of last resort. You can't just start listening to people's phone calls. The government has to provide a full and complete statement explaining why normal police work, like physical surveillance, confidential informants, search warrants or trash pulls, has either been tried and failed, or is just too dangerous or unlikely to succeed. Sims's lawyers argued that the DEA's application made it sound like they just jumped straight to a wiretap. The court completely disagreed. The judges pointed out that the affidavit clearly detailed an existing investigation into Sims in Louisville. Before the wiretap was even requested, they had a confidential source. They had conducted physical surveillance. They had subpoenaed his phone records. They had even obtained a pen register. That's a device that tracks numbers called. And had tried multiple trash pulls at his home over several months. The investigation wasn't new. It was just hitting a wall. Sims also argued the affidavit used boilerplate language, just generic phrases copied and pasted from other cases. Again, the court said no. While some language might be standard, the affidavit gave specific reasons why other methods wouldn't work in this particular case. For example, using an undercover agent was too risky, and a simple search warrant wouldn't uncover the full scope of a nationwide conspiracy. The government doesn't have to exhaust every single possible investigative tool before seeking a wiretap. They just have to show that they've made a reasonable effort and that the wiretap is essential to move forward. Then there was the issue of probable cause. Sims argued that the phone wasn't even registered in his name. It was registered to a Kiana Lawson. The court basically said, so what? It's incredibly common for criminals to use phones registered in other people's names. The standard for probable cause is just whether there's reason to believe the phone, is being used in a crime, not who legally owns it. And the evidence for that was overwhelming. They had the calls intercepted from Terry Flenory's phone. They had the contact name from the arrested driver's phone. They had the informant's testimony. And they had toll records showing over 200 calls in a single month between that phone and other known members of the BMF conspiracy. The court found there was more than enough probable cause. The wiretap was legal. The evidence stood, and Tory Sims's conviction was affirmed. The story of the BMF, however, doesn't end with those convictions in the late 2000s. It continues right present day, taking a sharp turn into one of the biggest legal questions of our time: compassionate release during a global pandemic. And at the centre of this new chapter is the man himself, Demetrius Big Meech Flannery. Fast forward to 2020. Demetrius Flannery is 51 years old, serving his third-year sentence at a federal prison in Oregon. He's scheduled for release in 2031. Then COVID-19 hits. The virus is tearing through correctional facilities, which are perfect breeding grounds for disease. Flannery files an emergency motion for compassionate release. He argues that his underlying health conditions, specifically hypertension and heart issues, put him at an extremely high risk for severe complications if he contracts the virus. He points to his brother Terry Flannery, who received the exact same 30-year sentence, had just been released to home confinement under the CARES Act. Terry also had health issues, but he had two things. Demetrius didn't: an earlier release date due to a sentence reduction and a clean prison disciplinary record. Demetrius Flannery's record, by contrast, was described by the court as checkered. He had lost 135 days of good conduct credit for serious violations over the years, things like possessing a cell phone, using another inmate's account, possessing intoxicants, and even having a razor blade. It wasn't a good look. Still, he argued he was a changed man, using his notoriety to be a positive influence on young men in prison, a mission he wanted to continue if released. The government's immediate response was simple: the court can't even hear this motion. Why? Because Flannery hadn't followed the rules. Under the First Step Act, a law passed in 2018 that made it easier for inmates to request compassionate release. There's a process. An inmate has to first ask the warden of their prison for release. The court can only get involved after. The inmate has exhausted all of their administrative appeals within the Bureau of Prisons, or, and this is the important part, after 30 days have passed since the warden received the request. Flannery had sent his request to the warden on April 17th. He filed his motion in court on April 22nd, only 5 days later. He hadn't waited the 30 days. This set up a huge legal question that courts all over the country were grappling with. Is this 30-day waiting period a rigid, unbreakable rule? Or, in the face of a deadly, fast-moving pandemic, can a judge just waive it? The courts were split. Some said the rule is the rule. Congress wrote it that way for a reason. But many others, including the judge in Flannery's case, took a more pragmatic view. They determined the rule was a claim processing rule, not a jurisdictional one. That's a fancy way of saying it's there to keep things orderly, but a judge can set it aside in extraordinary circumstances to prevent undue prejudice. So the question became, was Demetrius Flannery facing undue prejudice? Would forcing him to wait the full 30 days put him in such grave danger that the court needed to step in immediately? The judge analysed two things: personal risk and environmental risk. On personal risk, the court acknowledged that Flannery's hypertension did put him at a high risk of complications if he got sick. However, his condition was stable, and his BOP medical records showed he was receiving all his medications on time. His situation wasn't as dire as many others. Then there was the environmental risk. At the time of the ruling in May 2020, FCI Sheridan, the prison where Flannery was housed, had 0 confirmed cases of COVID-19 among its inmates. This was a critical fact. The judge contrasted Flannery's situation with another case, United States versus Saad. In that case, the inmate Saad was a 71-year-old non-violent offender